Good morning and welcome. 1st of April, the year is rolling through in a way that none of us could have ever expected to have occurred. So I'm the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry CEO, Paul Guerra. My pleasure to welcome you all here today. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Tamsin Lawrence, who's our Workplace Relations Deputy Director from the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Tamsin is doing some incredible work on behalf of us all. For example, it's really pleasing to see the unions, the employer groups and the government coming together at this time. And I can tell you that Tamsin has been at the inner circle of those conversations. And Tamsin, it's great to have you with us this morning. Good morning.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure. I want to talk a bit about the Modern Awards and the work that you've been doing behind the scenes. What are the recent changes that have been adapted to the Modern Awards?
Well, obviously there's 120 Modern Awards, so there's a lot to get through. But with the unions, we've had them come to the table with employers. It's quite an unusual situation. The ACCU has brought together ACCI and with ARG, and we've been working to try and change some of the Modern Awards to make it easier for people to, one, work from home or to change their arrangements to adapt to circumstance. So at this stage, we've had 3 Modern Awards which have effectively had a schedule put into them, which makes temporary changes to the way that award functions. The main one for most people will be the Clerks Award. The Clerks Award covers almost 1 million employees. It covers any kind of admin staff you've got someone who's doing your HR or your payroll, anyone who's kind of doing call centre work, they're usually covered by the Clerks Award. And the changes in that award are really to enable greater flexibility, because a lot of those people are now sitting at home and they might have to be looking after kids during the day. And so the changes in that award, for example, are changes to the working hours. So if someone wants to get up early and do some work and look after their kids during the day and then work late at night, they can now agree to do that with their employer, and the employer won't suffer any overtime that normally would apply in that circumstance. The other thing is there's other changes like being able to agree to double annual leave effectively at half pay if someone wanted to spread that out so they get a little bit more money trickling in over a longer period. There's a range of other changes that I would suggest if you are covered by that award in particular, most people will be in some respect. To have a look, there's a really good summary that's been put out about it, and try and use those new opportunities that have been put into that award to give yourself as much wiggle room as you can to make changes that will work for both your employees, and for you as an employer. The other awards that have been changed are pretty industry specific. So the Hospitality and the Restaurant Award, given that they were one of the first industries to kind of be hit by the government's directions to either close in the case of pubs and clubs, and then in the case of restaurants and cafes to only turn into takeaway. There have been a couple of changes to their awards to enable them to, again, just make changes that might enable them to keep trading for as long as possible. So again, the changes in those awards are very industry specific, but if you are covered, if you are a cafe, if you are a restaurant, definitely go and have a look at those changes, because they are basically only being done to benefit you as an employer, so that you can keep on your employees for as long as possible, and make those necessary changes because circumstances mean you're probably not trading like you used to. You're probably got delivery people now doing unusual tasks that you didn't before, and those changes are only temporary, but they're intended to help you for as long as we can possibly provide that help. Now, obviously, there are a hell of a lot more awards to get through. We are continuing the conversations with the unions, and they are they've been very good. They are coming to the table and saying, yeah, what are we discussing next? Retail, for example, is definitely one that's on the cards that's being discussed. And we will try and push through these changes as quick as we can. We've had great response from the Fair Work Commission, who basically within a space of around 24 to 36 hours will stamp off these changes where there's agreement between employers and unions. So we are moving as fast as we can in a relatively slow-moving environment, typically in awards, but we are seeing some really good changes, and we think that clerks, restaurants and hospitality are a really good template for the next lot of awards to pick and choose some of the really good changes that have been made in those. So if you are covered, I strongly recommend going and having a look at those changes and seeing if they might be able to help you function a bit better.
So Tamsin, where would we look for those awards? And you mentioned the Clerks Awards summary.
Yeah,
Where's the best place to look for that?
I'm sure the Victorian Chamber has got a good summary on your website. The Australian Chamber definitely does. I'm sure that the workplace relations team can send out something to everyone and to let them know about those changes. If you want to see the award itself, the Fair Work Ombudsman and the Fair Work Commission website have those versions. But if you just want someone to quickly summarise it, definitely go to the Chamber websites to get that information.
Okay, so fantastic. So that's back to the Victorian Chamber site. We can link you up to the Australian Chamber site as you need, but as you said, also Fair Work. I must admit, Tamsin, I was in one of those meetings with you, and I was just delighted at the camaraderie that sat around that table from the governments and the unions and the employer groups, as you mentioned, to move this ahead for the benefit of everybody.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is a very unusual circumstance, and I think everybody has the same goal in mind, and that's to keep as many businesses open for as long as possible and as many people in work and in their job for as long as possible. So given that, it has been an unusual but a fantastic outcome, we think, the changes we're seeing.
Yeah, so you've been sitting around the table and you've heard it from the union side, from the employers' side, and certainly we've been feeding from the Victorian Chamber some of the commentary that we're hearing. But what are you seeing are the biggest concerns that people are having when they're thinking of standing down their workers?
Well, Standdown, unfortunately, was drafted before people really ever considered a pandemic, and so the current wording doesn't quite always make that much sense to people. So effectively, just so everyone understands what the test is for a stand down in these kind of situations, is that your staff can't be usefully employed because of a stoppage of work for which the employer cannot be held reasonably responsible. So interpreting that, it basically means that you can no longer use your staff in any useful way, and for a reason that you didn't create yourself. So obviously, where businesses are being shut down by the government, for example, that's a really cut and dry one. So if you're a gym, you're a cafe, you're a beauty salon, you have every right to stand everyone down. And in that circumstance, not a problem. But where you're a business that just isn't trading well, say, you're making 10% of what you used to make during this time of year, or you're not able to get all of your stock in at the moment, but you're still able to get a bit of stuff in. There, it's really quite unclear as to whether or not you're in a position to legally stand down your employees or not. So we strongly suggest if you are in a position where you're just not trading all that well, there is some capacity with the social distancing rules coming in and where you perhaps just can't get anything in from overseas to stand people down. But it's really quite a grey area. So we strongly recommend getting some advice in that space if you are in it, because if you do make a mistake and you do stand people down when they lawfully were not in a position to be stood down, you could have a claim from your employees at the end of this from either a breach of contract, a breach of your enterprise agreement, and in that circumstance they can probably recover wages that they would have earned during the period of which you shouldn't have stood them down. So the liability can be quite big if you don't just have that little bit of additional thought before you stand them down. So we'd strongly recommend, the likes of Qantas and Myer and so forth have done it, but they've done it with some solid legal advice and backing before they have. So we strongly recommend doing the same. So
what I'm hearing you say is be cautious, get the right advice, and be fully aware of what the stand down provisions mean. For example, that annual leave still accrues during that period that an employee stood down.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important that, yes, you're not paying your employee, but all of their other normal entitlements, even longer service leave, continues to accrue in most cases for a period of 6 months, annual leave, their personal leave, etc. The other thing to bear in mind that people often don't quite know is that if an employee is on annual leave or personal leave, they're not technically stood down at that time. You can't be doing both of those at the same time. That doesn't mean that you can't agree to an employee to perhaps allow them to take some annual leave before you stand them down. But that just needs to be an important consideration. It's all a little bit technical. So we do suggest just being careful, getting advice, and then taking the steps you need to take.
Of course, hopefully stand downs become less of an issue with the new JobKeeper payment.
Yeah.
You just touch on what employers should be thinking about if they're considering the new JobKeeper payment?
Absolutely. If you are considering the JobKeeper payment and you have either stood down your employees or you've let them go, it's really important that you have a bit of a quick think about, one, if you've stood them down, whether you would like to apply and register for that JobKeeper payment, because it's probably pretty likely that if you've already stood down your employees that they might have gone to try and get the job seeker payment, which is the effectively the Centrelink payment, and they will no longer be entitled to that if you go and seek the JobKeeper payment. So it's important that you have that conversation with your staff if you have already stood them down. If you have already let them go, there's an opportunity now for you to put them back on your books if they were on your books at the 1st of March and you've taken them off since by making them redundant or whatever other steps you took. In that circumstance, it's probably important that you do that. Go seek some advice from your accountant, do the math and figure out, are you in a better position by bringing them back on in the long term or not? So we'd strongly suggest you've stood them down as well, to go and just figure out, do the numbers, and get some advice, because it's also not yet clear, because we obviously don't have the legislation yet from the government, whether you're winding back and going back in time and imagining you never stood them down, for example, or whether you're bringing them back on again and rehiring them. It's not yet clear which kind of path people need to go down. So if someone does approach you and say, hey, is there any opportunity for me to come back on and work for you if you've stood them down? Or if you think, I really want to approach someone and bring them back because of this change in circumstance and this money might now enable you to keep them on, we strongly recommend you saying to them something like, if you could just quarantine that payment you received, whether it be redundancy pay, they might have been paid out for annual leave or long service leave, quarantine that money. It will only probably be about another week till we know how this is all going to function. But in the meantime, it'd be best if they don't, go and spend that money on something that might mean you can't go back in time when we eventually see the legislation. So if they can quarantine it, I'd strongly recommend it. But definitely think about whether that's going to be a good option for you in the circumstance. The other thing that's really important to note is some casuals are covered by this. Full-time staff, obviously part-time staff, but if the casual's been with you for 12 months on a regular basis, you can probably also make a claim to get the JobKeeper payment for them. And in that circumstance, they actually might be getting more out of the JobKeeper payment than they normally get. So it's important to consider if that's going to happen, perhaps, what additional hours you might try, or shifts you might try and get them to get, or what tasks they're doing. You may need to change your actual arrangement with that employee. So that's just another thing to bear in mind, depending on what types of staff you have employed.
Yeah, it's very comprehensive, the JobKeeper initiative, and as you've touched on, there's a few things through there. Talking to your staff, the staff had to have been on your books at 1st of March, and as you quite rightly point out, it's for all staff, full-time, part-time, and casuals as well. We know through the helpline that we're getting a number of queries about the finer details on it, and Tamsin, I know you're working with us. As we get the clarification back from the federal government, either directly through the department or through the ATO, and we'll continue to update an FAQ with the right information there. So please keep ringing the helpline or connect in on the website and find that frequently asked question sheet so you can make the decisions that you need. But just, Tamsin, if you could recap, if you've recently stood down or let go employees in response to the COVID-19, what should you be considering doing now?
Yeah, sure. With your employees that have been stood down, one, it's important if you do decide you're going to pick up the JobKeeper payment, and in most circumstances probably people will decide to do that because it's no expense to you and they're already stood down. So there's no additional payment that you'll need to make to them aside from the $1,500 per fortnight pre-tax that you'll need to pass on to them. But it's important to notify your staff. It's going to be a legislative requirement to notify them. So if you've registered and you'll soon be applying once the ATO sends that out, it's important that you let your staff know that you're thinking of doing that. And if you've let someone go, it's important that you have that conversation with them if you're thinking of bringing them back, and mentioning about quarantining that money if they possibly can. And the other thing we always suggest in these circumstances, if you've stood down your employees, it's a really good idea to keep in contact with them. They're not working for you at this point in time, but they are still technically your employees, and they will remain so until we come out of the other end of this pandemic saga. So we strongly recommend staying in contact with them, keeping up those good relations, because it's those staff that you're going to need at the other end to turn back up your business and get back to where you used to be. So as much as you can stay in contact with them, keep them happy, check in with them, I think that's always going to put you in a good stead at the other end of this.
Tamsin, that's been brilliant. Some really helpful and valuable information for everybody there. I appreciate your time today. Of course, the Victorian Chamber is a really key and proud part of the Australian Chamber. So for all Victorian Chamber members, if you need more help, you can call our workplace relations team on Melbourne 03 8662 5222, and Katie, Helen, and the team there are linked with Tamsin very closely, and we're all here to help you. So, thanks again, Tamsin.
No worries, thanks for having me.
Of course, please stay in touch with the Victorian Chamber website for more information, and that is victorianchamber.com.au, and of course the state government's website, which is business.vic.gov.au. There's a whole bunch of valuable information on both those websites, and as you know, and as we've been with the journey, we're here to help. So thank you, enjoy your week. I hope to see you next Wednesday. Thank you.